Okay, can I steal the screen share?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, cool. So, yeah, so Naomi and I are going to be presenting on how to pass your programming interview. Sorry. Yeah, so I guess first we'll introduce ourselves. So I'm Jessie. I am an algo engineer at Hudson River Trading. So that is a high frequency trading company based in New York. Before that, I worked at Google for about 6 years. So between the two companies, I've given somewhere over 100 interviews. I also do resume screening for my company. I do a lot of career fairs. So that's sort of like how I'm involved in the like interviewing and hiring space.
Yeah, and hi everyone. I'm Naomi, senior software engineer at Google. I actually just took a break from Google and joined a startup for a year. So I recently went through the interview game myself, but I'm back at Google. And in total, I've spent about 5 years at Google. I've worked mostly on Google Maps. Currently, I'm working on Google Classroom, which is the EDU offering. And like Jessie, I've done a lot of interviews, both like received and given, and lots of outreach on campus.
Okay, so I guess the way this is going to work is so first we're going to talk through like what does an interview look like what are the steps to it, and then Naomi will talk about like common mistakes that candidates make, and then we'll do a live mock interview, and then we'll open it up for as many questions as you all have. So how do you prepare for an interview? So once you get an interview scheduled, the first thing you want to do is start reviewing your data structures and algorithms. So as a spoiler, a lot of interviews involve, in terms of algorithms, doing either BFS or DFS. So be sure to practice those. And for data structures, a lot of times you'll be using either hash maps, hash sets, or heaps. So for all three of those, make sure you know how to implement them and use them, and make sure you know the time complexity of all of their operations. And then you want to figure out from your recruiter what format the interview is going to be in. So, it might be on a whiteboard, probably not this year, but you might be coding in a coder pad or a shared Google Doc or something like that. And you kind of want to know what it's going to be like, because if you're used to coding in an IDE where you have tab completion and like auto importing, and then you get to your shared doc and you like can't remember how to import anything, like that is going to throw you off. So just make sure you know like what format it's in so that you know what format you want to be practicing in. One of the hardest things to do in an interview is to talk out loud. And I'll go a little bit into like why that's important later on. But in general, I'll say like that is not a skill you're just going to pick up from coding. That's a skill you have to specifically practice. So, sit down with a friend virtually, take turns interviewing each other. And while you're coding, make sure you're talking out loud while your friend listens. And it's going to feel really awkward, but you want to feel awkward now instead of feeling awkward in the interview. Finally, a lot of people ask me what's the best language to interview in. And the answer is always going to be whatever your strongest language is, no matter what that is. That's the language you're going to look like the best developer in. You're going to code the fastest. You're going to be able to explain in the most detail why you're choosing to do things the way you're doing them. You're going to have the most understanding of like the technical implementation of all the data structures. Like you're just going to look much stronger in that language. So don't try to like pick the language to match the company. So when you're given an interview question, typically it's going to look like you're given some sort of input and you need to perform an algorithm on it to return some sort of output. So given a linked list, return if it has a cycle. Given a string, return if it's a palindrome. Given two sorted arrays, return the intersection of them. So that's usually what it's going to look like. Once you're given that question, the first thing you want to do in the interview is to ask clarifying questions. So that means like, what are the edge cases for your problem? What about the problem is kind of ambiguous? So let's say you're given a string. You'll probably want to ask, does this string contain spaces? Can it contain punctuation? Do I have to worry about capitalization? Like, does that affect my algorithm? If you're given an array of ints, you could say, okay, are these ints always positive? Could they be floats instead of ints? Are they sorted? Like anything that's going to affect how you run your algorithm is something you want to clarify ahead of time. And that's actually one of the skills that I think translates most directly to a job, because when you are given a problem at work, no one is going to like clearly define it for you. It's going to be super vague. You're going to have to figure out like what the vague parts are. You're going to have to define them yourself. You need to understand how defining them affects the way you're going to solve the problem. And so this is your chance to show that you have that skill set to your interviewer. So don't skip the clarifying questions. So once you like fully understand like all the caveats of your problem, you want to come up with a few different approaches and talk through them. So this is your chance to show off that you can speak about the trade-offs between different approaches. You can say, oh, if we do it this way, it's going to be log n. If we do it this way, it'll be n, but it'll be a little more memory efficient. And so depending on the context, maybe you want to use a different approach. So, this is your chance to really show off to your interviewer that you like understand time complexity and space complexity and like what different contexts, like how those affect what you should choose. So in order to talk through different approaches, though, you have to have multiple approaches. So that means you really want to start with coming up with the brute force approach and then start optimizing, because you need to be able to say the reason this solution is good is because it's better than these other solutions and then compare them. So don't jump straight to optimizing. Once you have your approach, you want to fully plan out your algorithm. So this is actually the part I see most interviews go wrong. You're really feeling the time pressure. You want to start coding right this second because you're really worried you're going to run out of time. And so you kind of like come up with a fuzzy algorithm you haven't fully defined and you just jump right into coding. And then 10 minutes into coding, you hit an edge case, maybe even an edge case you discussed in the clarifying questions part, and you realize that your code is not going to work for it. And there's no way to fix it. And you have just lost 10 minutes and you need to recode a whole lot of stuff. And your plan to like try to speed through this problem did not work. So really like take the extra 2 minutes at the beginning to plan out how you want this to work, to make sure you understand how you're going to handle every edge case ahead of time and that you can with your plan. Sometimes I'll see people actually like write out in comments like every step they're going to take, or maybe they'll pseudocode it ahead of time. And actually, when I see people do that, those tend to be the solutions that people code the fastest and that have the least amount of bugs. So if you're worried about time, like this is not where you save time. You save time by like really planning it ahead of time so that you don't mess anything up while coding. Okay, talking out loud. So while you're coding, you really want to be talking out loud about what you're doing and why you're doing it. What the different options are, why you're doing it this way instead. So when I'm hiring someone, I am not trying to hire someone who is really good at reversing linked lists. Like that is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who I can tell by the way they solved this problem that they're also going to be able to solve the next problem I give them, no matter what it is. And the way you show that is by talking about why you're making the decisions you're making. Even if I disagree with the decision you're making, if you can justify it, if I know that it was like a well thought out decision, that's perfect. So, talk out loud about why you're doing things the way you are as you go, so that I can leave the interview with the confidence that you are good at working through problems. Test with good test cases. So depending on the format of your interview, this is going to look a little bit different. If you're interviewing on a whiteboard or somewhere where you don't have access to code execution, you're going to want to walk through your code with an example. I see a lot of people walk through code with a really simple example that includes no edge cases, and then they miss every single bug in their code because all the bugs are around the edge cases. Like that's, where you tend to mess stuff up. So make sure that even when you pick a short, small example, it's going to be something that's actually going to test your code. Naomi will talk a little bit more about that later. And then if you are working in a situation where you do have access to code execution, I generally recommend you try to come up with an example for every edge case you want to test. So usually the way I see people do that is they will like run their code with that example input and they'll print the output and then they'll like visually check that it looks correct. And that's totally fine. That's a valid way of doing it. If you want to really stand out to an interviewer, do it as test cases. You know, be like, assert that when I call it on this input, I get this output. That is going to look so strong. You're going to look like you really know how to write unit tests. You understand the value of testing and of good code coverage. That's just like a really easy, fast way to stand out to an interviewer. Last step, be ready for follow-up questions. So when I give an interview, if I have 45 minutes, I will have 45 minutes of content no matter what. So if you finish the first problem really fast, I have a follow-up question. And if you finish that one really fast, I have another follow-up question, and we will keep going. And so just be ready for that. You know, if I give you the question, let's say, given a tree and 2 nodes, find the least common ancestor of those 2 nodes. So maybe once you finish coding it, I'll say, okay, well, what if instead of 2 nodes, we have a list of n nodes? How would you modify your code? And now you have to go through and edit your code and make it do a new thing. So yeah, practice that a little bit. Just be ready that it might happen. It's very normal. Okay, common mistakes.
Yeah, so now I'm going to go through some common mistakes that we see people making in interviews. And a lot of this is going to be pretty similar to what Jessie already talked about, but I think it's important to reiterate. I don't have control though, Jessie.
Oh my God. Okay, you're just going to have to tell me when you want to go. Sorry.
Okay, so first one, immediately jump into coding. Jessie already talked about this as we went through the structure of the interview. You know that coding was like step 4 on the list. And yet we see so many people doing this. It's, you know, even for a really simple problem that seems really straightforward, it's just never a good idea to start writing code right away. I know people can be tempted to even like start, you know, just write the method header. But really, I would advise you to do the steps correctly, to make sure you've asked clarifying questions, then to make sure you've talked through various solutions. And like once you've fully explained the algorithm to the interviewer, then write code. What can happen is you start writing something and then it turns out that you're writing an approach that we didn't really want you to write. You know, I think sometimes people forget that like the interviewer has their own thing going on and they're trying to get you to do a particular thing. Like a lot of the time, you know, my favorite interview question has multiple solutions, but I really want all the candidates to write the same one involving the hash map. So I'll try to make sure we get there and that we have that solution before we write code. So yeah, just don't be tempted to do it. Yeah. Okay, next one. Okay, other big thing, once you're done writing code, not running through an example, huge problem. I don't know anybody who flawlessly writes code correct the first time. Like it can happen, but it's super rare. Like even myself, I very frequently mess it up. Even when Jessie and I are practicing the mock interview that we're gonna do, I always make a typo, like at least one. So it's okay, but just don't be overconfident that your code is perfect. I see so many people write all the code out and immediately be like, okay. And like they're sitting there waiting for what to do. And really, you should be more proactive about this, because if it was a real job, you would not just like sit back and be like, cool, I wrote it. It's good now, right? You got to test your code. I know that everyone's doing coder pads these days because of virtual interviews. So I know that it is possible in a lot of situations to run your code and to create test cases. And that's great. But I personally don't think that's necessary. You know, I think can be helpful to even just go through line by line and read through your code and just logically make sure that it makes sense. And I know myself as an interviewer, and I'm sure there are plenty of other interviewers, don't always run your code later. They don't care that it's super syntactically correct, but it's just good to make sure that you've like done the due diligence to try and make sure it looks as good as it can. And it's also, you know, a great exercise to take whatever example they gave you in explaining the problem and just run through that and make sure like line by line it's working correctly. And in general, I would say, yeah, make sure that while you've been writing the code, you've thought about edge cases and you handled null checks or empty strings. It's always going to be a situation where you want to talk with the interviewer, because sometimes they'll tell you, hey, I don't care about this. Let's not waste time on that. But it's better to like go above and beyond than not at all. Yeah, and I guess, well, the last comment I'll say on that is also don't waste too much time. Like in general, you want to think about the interview as a conversation, and you kind of want to feel out what the interviewer wants. And it's totally okay to ask and be like, hey, like, do you think, like I should keep going, running through more examples, or do you think this is good? Like, it's just good to have that dialogue. You also don't want to waste too much time, because they might actually have another question for you, or, a follow-up that's like going to be more useful for you to answer. Okay, next one. Okay, not writing real code. So many people are tempted to write pseudocode, and that's fine as long as you're just doing it briefly for yourself to like understand what's going on. I think some people think that pseudocode is helpful for the interviewer. I don't think that's the case. You have to keep in mind that like in most situations, the interviewer has asked this question so many times that they're so intimately familiar with it. They're very clear on what the solution is, and they don't really they just need to understand what you're saying, and they don't need you to write the pseudocode. It's not necessarily helpful for them, but if it's for you, go for it. I would just say be careful, because a lot of people run out of time because they wrote pseudocode. And then, another common thing that people will do is take the pseudocode and morph it into real code, and that just gets really messy. So I would advise you to focus on verbally explaining it, which is basically the same thing that pseudocode is, and then to like write actual real syntactically correct code. And I would say in general, again, it's fine if you make typos. I know in a lot of these situations, you might have autocomplete, you might not. The interviewer doesn't really care. Like when you have a job, you'll have an IDE most of the time where that'll correct you. But it looks better if you can just write syntactically correct code. So I would say like practice that. If you say that your strongest language is Java, and then you like don't remember how to like find the length of a string in Java, it's just like a little concerning on some level. Like, do they know Java? If you do need to do that, by the way, I would say make sure you tell your interviewer. Like if you're like, hey, I'm sorry, it's been a while, I forgot how to do X in this language, I'm gonna make it up. Totally fine. In fact, I would recommend doing that over Googling something, because it just like, even on a remote Zoom type of call, it's gonna look kind of weird. Like, what is that person doing? It's just better to have the open, honest conversation about it. Oh yeah, and then the last tip here would be, don't feel like you necessarily have to write all of the helpers, but also like don't assume. And, again, just talk to the interviewer. They might say, hey, this piece of the problem makes sense to have a helper for, and I don't really care about you writing it. Or they might say, hey, I do think you should write that. So just make sure you talk to them about all those things. Okay, another mistake you can make, especially if you've been practicing a ton for interviews and you've done a million practice problems, you might think, oh, wow, this problem sounds exactly like this problem I did on HackerRank last week. It's probably the same solution. Don't assume that. A lot of the times you might end up solving that problem again, which is not the problem. And it always looks a little weird when somebody's like trying to regurgitate from memory something that they did before. Like, it's great to practice, and it's great to identify like templates of problems and to notice when they're similar. But I would say, like, in the end, an interview is really about showing how you think. So it's really good if you can show from scratch how you think through to the solution, which kind of a lot of the times means, thinking about it again and not just remembering the old solution and regurgitating it. Okay, last one that we have here, we mentioned that it's really good to think through multiple solutions and like try to find the best one, do like time, space, complexity trade-offs. But I see a lot of people getting so stuck in that sometimes and never actually moving on to coding. I would say most companies would agree that it's better to have a working solution than the most optimal working solution. So if you find yourself just like really not being able to get whatever you might think, oh, I have an O of n squared solution. That can't be the best, but I can't come up with anything better. Like, it's okay. you know, a lot of time you'll talk with the interviewer and they might say, yeah, just like, let's go for it. If they really want you to get a better solution, they might start giving you hints. You should pay attention to that. But at the end of the day, like, you want to show your skills, and most companies are evaluating you on problem solving and on coding. So you want to make sure you do get to coding. And I will also say, like, I used to ask an interview problem that there was only one solution, at least that I knew of, and it was brute force. And it drove people crazy because they kept thinking, wait, this can't possibly be the best thing, but it was. You know, and I think it's good to say, you know what, it's okay. Brute force sometimes is the best that I can come up with. Yeah, I think that's about it. Just like one last thing I'll say high level, if I didn't reiterate this enough, is just like, remember that your interviewer is a person too. Most of the time they want you to succeed. Like, it's hard if you've never been on the other side and you're interviewing, but you've never been an interviewer. But like, it's so much more rewarding when you get a candidate who really knows what they're doing, who's like working hard, even if they don't know everything, you know, somebody who's just like open and, you know, listens to your hints and really tries to succeed is like honestly worth so much. So just remember that they're a human too, and you can talk to them. They're not scary. They're a real person. They were in your shoes one time. Like Jessie and I were absolutely in everyone's shoes at some point, interviewing like crazy everywhere, trying to figure out how it all worked. And it does get better. So, okay.
Okay, cool. So we're gonna do a mock interview to try to like show off some of these techniques. So can we all see my coder pad? Is that okay? Cool. Ring, ring, ring.
Hello.
Hi, this is Jessie from Hooli. Is this Naomi?
Yes, this is Naomi.
Is this still a good time for an interview?
It's a great time.
Awesome. Okay, so we only have 15 minutes, so we're gonna jump right into coding. I see you in our coder pad. So, the problem is find the inserted character in two strings with otherwise identical characters. So let me give you an example. Let's say we have the strings ABC and ABCX. So in this case, one of the strings has an extra character X. So that's what you would return. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm noticing that in the example you gave, the characters are in the same order in both strings other than the X. Will that always be the case?
No, good question. So I might give you the string BAC and then AXCB. So you can see that these strings are in completely different orders, but we would still return X in this case.
Another question I have, you know, would it be possible to have a character that was a duplicate of another character? Like maybe this example?
Yeah, that's totally valid.
Okay, and are all possible characters allowed? Like, would I see a question mark or an exclamation mark?
Yeah, we're gonna say any ASCII character.
Cool. Would you consider an uppercase character to be the same as a lowercase, or are those different?
We'll say that those are different.
Cool. So the first thing that comes to mind would be kind of a brute force approach, where for every character in the first string, I would want to count how many times it appears in that string and then count how many times it appears in the other string and then see if those counts are the same. And if the counts aren't the same, then I would know that was the extra character.
Okay,
That
so
should be like a O of n squared solution.
yeah, that's pretty good. Do you think you can improve on that?
Yeah. So one thing I could do is basically sort the strings by their ASCII value, which would put them in like the same order, and then kind of linearly traverse them. And when I found a mismatch, so in this case, like B would not match A, I would know that the longer string had that extra character.
Okay, What's the
So
time
it's gonna, like, sort the
complexity?
strings and then traverse. And that would be like O of n log n because of the sorting.
Okay, cool. Any better?
Yeah. So, if we use a little bit of space, which is a trade-off, we could, instead of, my brute force where I counted, but then like recounted multiple times, we could count using a hash map. So I could build a hash map that said, A has one character, B has one, C has one for my first string. And then as I loop through the second string, I could decrement those counts. And if I encountered a character that didn't exist in the hash map, I would know to return that, like in the case with the X example. Or if I encountered a character that was already down to 0, I would know that it was an extra. That should be O of n time complexity.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Let's code it.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to be writing Java. Okay, so, based on the description of the problem, this seems like the method header. Does it look good to you?
Yeah, that looks right. You should be returning a character.
Yeah, so we're taking in 2 strings and returning a character. And the first thing I want to do is handle some edge cases. Oh, well, that's weird. Okay. So like if A was null or B was null, I'm just going to assume that this would be kind of like an invalid case.
Okay.
And I'm going to throw an exception. Cool. Another question I have for you, is it going to always be true that the first string is shorter and the second string is the longer one?
Thank you for clarifying that. That is not true. The first one could be the longer string.
Cool. So then I think in that case, we'll just do a little swap. So now I'll set them equal like that. But if the length of A is less than the length of B, I'm going to want to do the opposite. Okay. And another error check I want to handle real quick is if the lengths don't differ by exactly 1, we'll throw another exception. Cool. So now I'm going to create my hash map to store the character counts. And I'm going to run through my shorter string, which should be the one without the extra character, and get each character. And I'm just building my map, so you can do this thing in Java 8 where you do get or empty. So you can get whatever the current value is at the map if it exists, or 0 if it doesn't exist, and then increment it. And then now I'm going to go through my second string. Oh. And again, get the character. So now I want to handle my checks. So, oh, and I've already messed up my variable name here. Okay. All right. So if this character isn't even in my map, like the case we had with the X, then I know that that's the character. Otherwise, I can get the count. And if the count is already 0, then I also know this is the character, like in the case with the duplicate A. Then I want to go ahead and update my map. And at the end of all of this, we should never really get here, but if we did, this would be problematic too. Okay, so now that I'm done, I'm gonna go ahead and run through one of the examples because I'm sure I had at least one typo. So let's do this example. So A should be equal to BAC and B should be equal to AXCB. Neither string is null, so that's good. We're going to go ahead and set longer equal to B and shorter equal to A. I guess we can say cool. Now, if the length of A, so that should be 3, is less than the length of B, so that should be 4, so it should be true. And that's not correct because I would be swapping them incorrectly, so I think it should be the greater than sign. Cool. If it's greater, which it's not in this case, we would swap. Now, the length of longer, again, is 4. And shorter is 3 plus 1. Yes, this should be good. 4 is not equal to 3. Cool. Then I'm going to build my hash map. I'm going to go through shorter. I'm going to get the character. So that's B. I'm going to put it with 0 plus 1. Cool. Then the next one, A, same thing. C, same thing. Then as I go through my longer one, the first character I encounter is A. The map does have A, so we're not going to return. The count is currently 1, so we're not going to return. And we're going to decrement it. Then the next character I encounter is X, and that is not in our map, so I'm going to return it. Cool. So that example looks good, and it looks like it would work for the other example with the duplicate as well.
Awesome. Okay. Are there any other edge cases that you think are worth handling in here?
So one thing that comes to mind, so while I am checking that the lengths aren't quite the same, like the length should differ by 1, but it is possible, like you could have ABC and XYZF or something, where they differ in length by 1, but they have totally different characters. And I'm guessing this would be considered an invalid case.
Yeah, so you'd probably want to throw an exception. So I won't make you code this, but like talk me through how you would solve a case like this.
Yeah, so for a situation like this, I wouldn't want to return right away when I hit my mismatch cases. I would probably instead have like a Boolean flag or something that kept track of whether or not I'd already encountered a mismatch. And if I encountered another mismatch, like my flag was already true, then I would throw the exception.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like it would work. Awesome. Well, we're out of time, so it was really good to meet you. Thanks for interviewing with us.
Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Okay, awesome. So that's kind of like what an interview would look like. And that brings us to the end of our content. So at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. I will stop sharing. I know a lot of people posted questions in the chat at the beginning. Those have gone so far away, so you will have to repost them if we didn't see your question.
I actually do
Yeah.
have them written down already, the ones that were posted earlier.
Oh, okay. okay. You're ahead of me. That's great.
I can read them out to you. So the first one that was posted was, if you are primarily self-taught / learned on the job, and the amount of information that you feel you need to learn for a technical interview, there's no word there. Where's the best place to start if that's your situation?
I would say, I think everyone learns mostly on the job. Like, no matter what your background, if you went to college, if you did a boot camp, if you just like did a lot of Code Academy, there's really nothing that replaces working with a lot of people on like a very large code base. So yeah, I think that's just generally true, as you'll see when you're like start working in industry. And then what was the second part?
Just like what can you do? I would have wanted to comment on this. I think somebody also asked about cracking the coding interview. I think that's a great book if you're unsure of what types of content or what things you need to know. Yeah. If you went through that book, you would be incredibly well prepared for any technical interview. And especially if you're coming from like a boot camp or a self-taught world, that should like that set of algorithms and data structures knowledge should be more than enough to get you through.
I think a lot of people are practicing now on like LeetCode and HackerRank, and those are good resources, but I think they a little bit undervalue things like talking out loud. So, make sure that you're not forgetting those parts of practicing.
Yeah, I've also done interviews where like, my problem involved a tree and the candidate had never heard of a tree. And that was fine. I just explained it to them and then kind of expected that they would maybe need a little bit of help during the interview, but like didn't hold it against them at all.
Nice. All very good answers. So the next question that was in the chat was, do you have examples of resources with good test cases for various problems? Basically like resources to address edge cases that I might not have thought of.
No.
I mean, I do think like HackerRank type of stuff is really good for things like this because they like tell you most of the time, like, hey, you're missing these cases. I will also say, I know it's a weird time and everyone's like at home, but one of the things that helped me best in college was practicing with other people who were studying for interviews and like interviewing each other. And a lot of times in those situations, when you're both really invested in the problem, you're more likely to notice these weird edge cases. Like I'm sure all of you noticed my bug before I did in the interview. So yeah.
Yeah, I think any website where like after you run your code, it's like, oh, well, here's all the test cases we tested on, and like it's too slow, and also it doesn't handle this input, and like stuff like that. Just seeing, practicing a few times, seeing when you like eventually catch them all before it tells you you missed it.
Nice. So I'll jump to the Q&A tab. We have some questions in there. So the first one is, I come from an ERP development background and have implemented Oracle ERP apps that are being used by thousands of users. Do interviewers ask about system design questions if you have no experience in working for building large user scale applications?
Yeah, so I can speak for Google specifically. I know system design is not something that gets added to the interview loop until you are a senior level candidate. So that would be like someone with like a lot of years of experience. And I would say like from what I've seen out in the wild too, that's a pretty standard thing. Like what you might get a system design question as a more junior candidate, but it's more likely in that case to just be like a fun exercise to see how you handle it and not like treated so intensely. I mean, it's a different type of interview problem than we went over today. And it's got its own set of challenges. There are some good online resources for that, but yeah, that just that's another one that you can study enough, I think, and do okay at it because you need to throw out the same kinds of buzzwords about databases and like network layer. But it's not something you're going to usually see for an entry level job.
I'll say my company asks it for new grads. We have different expectations, but some companies do have that.
Very true. Next question in the Q&A tab. We kind of touched on this earlier, but is Cracking the Coding Interview book the best resource to prepare for technical interviews?
I think it's a really good resource for it.
Nice. And then is the machine learning interview the same as the software engineering interview? Is the data science interview this different?
I don't know that we could speak to that. I would say like everything we talked about today is very much like for traditional software engineer roles. I think a lot of these other kind of like fringe roles have similar interviews, but probably you need to talk a lot more about your background or your experience with the like domain. It's a little different.
Yeah, I think a lot of the skills, things like talking about the trade-offs of different approaches are going to transfer. But yeah, this really just is a software engineering interview.
Makes sense. Let me jump back to the chat question. So this was to Naomi earlier when you mentioned your favorite interview question. What was that question you were talking about? Maybe you can say that.
I'm trying to think of when I said that particular thing, but actually this problem that we did today was my favorite interview question for a very long time until I asked it so much at Google that it got banned. So I'm not allowed to ask it anymore, which is why we went through it today. But you know, personally, I really like the problem that we went through today because there are multiple approaches and you get to see candidates kind of come up with a lot. One of the things that we didn't talk about yet, and I don't know if anybody noticed, but there's actually a more optimal solution to the problem. One that's, you know, O of n time complexity, but uses constant space and has something to do with the fact that you can only use ASCII characters. So I would challenge everybody to go think about that and see if they can come up with the answer. For me, I know like I never expect candidates to get that little trick solution, but I think it's really cute when they do. We'll just like leave that as a mystery.
Oh, someone got it in the chat. Yeah,
oh,
come work at Google if you got that.
It's but again, like things like that are complete tricks, and like I know like at Google you're not really supposed to like ask trick problems because it's like it's something that you would have to be like, oh, you'd make this weird mental connection. There's also another version of the solution that somebody put in the chat. There's like another one that's more like involving binary operations.
Nice. So any tips for organizing yourself to study?
Oh boy, I haven't studied in a while.
I don't think I'm the best role model for this because I never study for interviews, which I think is horrible, but I feel like giving interviews is great practice. Whenever I see like peers or coworkers going through the interview process, like they just kind of dedicate a lot of time to it, and that can really suck if you want to have like, you know, be productive at your job too. But like doing the things we've mentioned, you kind of have to dedicate time to them because it is such a weird niche set of knowledge that you probably don't use in your job or, you know, in your schoolwork or whatever you're doing. But you just kind of have to put the time in. And honestly, I think that can make a huge difference. Like a lot of people get their dream jobs purely just by like prepping for a couple months before.
Yeah, makes sense. There's a few that I'm gonna skip that aren't extremely relevant. So is it better to write a brute force code or spend time trying to get an optimal solution and possibly not having the time to code during the interview?
I almost always want to see a complete working solution at the end of the interview. So I think like between the two options, where in one case we have a working solution and in another case we don't, I'd rather have the brute force. But it would, I think, be important to me for you to understand that it was a brute force, for you to be like, I think I can optimize this, you know, and kind of show me that like with more time, you would have kept optimizing.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you know when to ask clarifying questions first before handling them as exceptions? For example, you wrote exceptions for null strings or two different strings rather than asking if these will be possible inputs.
Yeah,
That's a great
Naomi should not have
question.
done that.
Well, it's like, again, every interviewer is going to have their own preference. Like, for the sake of time, we maybe didn't ask like just as many questions as I should have. Probably in a real interview context, I would ask like, one, do I need to worry about these inputs? And like, two, what should I do in that case? But whenever anyone asks me that question, I always tell them to throw an exception because you would never return null or an empty string in production code. So that's just like a tiny thing, and probably not all interviewers care about it, but yeah, I think it's absolutely best to throw the exception because like, I see people trying to return like an empty character, which like isn't even really a thing. Just throw the exception for the invalid cases is my advice. And I don't know if any interviewer will really dock you for like assuming, that little thing. But again, everyone
Yeah,
has their preference. And in general, the best option if you're unsure is to talk about it and to clarify with the interviewer.
I think it's most important to get the cases that are going to affect your algorithm. Like those are the ones you really, really need to have up front.
Next question is, how do you explain a large employment gap, such as an extended maternity leave, especially if you're a career changer, so you don't have relevant work experience?
Well, this is not something that will usually come up in the technical interview. This is usually something that will come up in like a recruiter screen. We actually didn't really touch on this, but I would say most technical interviews, if you've never experienced one, will ask you 1 to 0 questions about your resume. Like pretty much always you're going to jump straight into the code. When you're talking to an actual software engineer, they're not really going to ask you about your resume, so it won't really matter if there's a gap. I don't know from a recruiting standpoint what they do, but like I know a lot of these companies care less about what your background is and more about what your skills are.
I've had some people just straight up put like 2017 to 2019 sabbatical with no other detail. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds like a problem for not this second, like I don't think you need to give a whole lot of detail.
Awesome. So during the interview, is it okay to run the code often, like do console.log often?
I have no problem with that.
Yeah, same. I think it's totally fine.
Great. And how do you stay sharp at problems like these when you have a job? I feel like daily work doesn't use algorithms to this extent. Do you set aside time to practice like this often?
You job hunted recently.
Yeah, and I'm the worst because I do not practice. And I mean, my life advice standpoint is that like I don't want to work at a job that like doesn't want me. So if they don't like what my skills are at this moment, like maybe it's not a good fit. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that's like great advice. If you really want to get a job, you have to put in the work. That's just how it goes.
I would say you really do need to specifically practice interviewing because I fully agree that like interviewing skills are different than working skills. Oftentimes, I'll actually notice that new grads tend to answer questions better than industry hires because they just came out of college. They just like put in all this time to practice this. And then industry hires are just so like, it's been so long since they practiced this stuff. So yeah, like you really just do need to like find the time to practice it.
Yeah, I would also say that it's really good practice if you're in a position to give interviews. Like I feel like you don't really understand all the pitfalls and things until you've asked the same question hundreds of times to people and seen all the different ways that it gets answered. So if you have an opportunity to interview at whatever company you're currently at, or even just like mock interview your friends, like it's so helpful.
Great, thank you. I think we're almost to time. I think we could take one more question. So best way to prepare in less than 2 months for new grads. What do you recommend?
I feel like we've a little bit answered this.
Yeah, I was just gonna like reiterate what Jessie said way earlier in the talk, which was get as many interviews as you can. That's also a great practice. Like just apply to a ton of places, interview everywhere. Don't turn down interviews, like do them for practice.
Feel free to waste companies' time. Just do it. It's fine.
Awesome. So we do have a lot more questions on the Q&A and coming through the chat. So Naomi and Jessie, do you have some time to answer them, or do you?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we started a few minutes late too, so I think it's fine.
Okay, awesome. So let's just keep trucking through. I'll try to skip ones that have been answered already. So for senior folks, are the coding challenges the same?
I usually give the same question, but I have different expectations. So I want you to get a little bit farther in the problem. I expect you to go into more details on different optimizations. I just expect more.
Yeah, for junior engineers, I expect that I will have to give hints, but for senior engineers, I expect them to like, do it flawlessly and like make sure that they've like, really thought through the problem. Like it just like a more professional delivery of it. But I asked the same questions.
On that topic, I feel like I've generally had a lot of students ask if getting a hint means you failed the interview. And I'm just gonna like answer that question right now that absolutely not.
Yeah. Also in general, like even if you don't get to a working solution, you didn't fail the interview. Like it's so much more about seeing your thought process and seeing how you solve problems and just seeing that you have the ability to write code. I mean, it's great if you can get to the working solution, but even if you don't, like don't beat yourself up, you might have still passed the interview.
Next question. What was your favorite interview you've led / facilitated and gone through, and why?
I think my favorite ones are where the candidate teaches me something. So they'll like use a weird Python thing I've never seen before, and I'll be like, okay, hold up, like talk me through this. And it like really gives them a chance to shine and show off their knowledge, or maybe like teach me something about like low level memory that I didn't know. And then, I have no idea if it's correct. I like have to Google it later. But yeah, I don't know. I like that. You can't really like force that to happen though.
Yeah, I would second that. I would say like, especially when you're in a situation where you've asked the question hundreds of times, when you see a candidate come up with a new solution, it's like, oh, so exciting. Like, wait, I've never seen this before. And like, so yeah, I mean, creative thinking is always fun. It's even fun to see people, even if it's like not necessarily the right, like it doesn't work in the end, but to like see them go down that thought process and like kind of realize that it doesn't work and why, like, it's interesting. I would also say it with respect to code styles too. I think it's really cool when I see people like, extract out things in a way that's really clever or like reduce the like number of lines of code slightly because of one little optimization. Like I think things like that are just like really nice. Like
One
not
day,
necessarily like reducing the big O, but being like, this would technically mean one less pass through the loop. Like I appreciate those.
one day someone's going to do test-driven development and they're going to write the tests before they start coding, and that is going to be the best interview of my life. It has never happened.
Can't necessarily recommend that either, but
I would love it personally.
So next question is, as a junior engineer who's trying to step into the industry, how do you not get totally stunted and crushed and lose motivation when you keep interviewing but never get called back?
I think one thing to keep in mind is this is a skill. It's not necessarily representative of your ability to code. It's its own skill. And because it's a skill, that means that every time you interview, that's practice. So your 10th interview is going to go so much better than your first interview. Try to look at it that way. Try to keep in mind that like this is the process of getting better at interviewing.
What kind of impact does a selection of programming language have in the interview for entry-level developers?
It can make you look really bad if you don't actually know the language. So like I think we said this before, but just pick your strongest language. I have a friend who likes to interview in Python because they're like, oh, it's like pseudocode. I can't recommend that. I think it's really embarrassing when the person is like, this is my strongest language, but like, I don't know how to do this or that or this, or like, and they just make all sorts of mistakes, like syntax mistakes, or like, they just like don't understand the core language. I just, I can't see that being good. usually companies will match you ahead of time. If you say my strongest language is X, they'll give you an interviewer who knows that language. But I've been in plenty of situations where the candidate chooses some obscure language, like people will be like, I want to write this in Ruby. That's totally fine. I think that in those cases, you just have to be prepared to answer a little more questions, because whenever somebody's writing Ruby, since I don't know that, I'm going to ask them like, hey, what does this do? What does that do? So, you know, it doesn't really matter what language, but, you know, some companies are going to want certain skills. Like they'll say, hey, we want you to use one of these languages, and then you should do that. But just in general, just pick your strongest language.
What's the difference between a front-end interview versus back-end?
I guess I would say if we were going to split interviews in that way, I don't know if I'd say there's back-end interviews. There's like programming interviews and front-end interviews. So this is a programming interview. Some companies have front-end specific interviews. My experience with those is it's a lot more JavaScript questions, things like, look at this really weirdly written JavaScript and tell me what it does. And it probably does something different than what it looks like it does. And that's kind of been what I've seen from front-end interviews. So it's very different than this.
Yeah, it'll be like some obscure closure thing. I've also seen ones that will be like, hey, we ideally want you to like create something that looks like mock, like, you know, red circle with the green square, and then like you have to write HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Companies are getting pretty creative with what I've seen. Like, I recently did an interview where like they also had their API up, and they were like, okay, make some requests to this API and show the data on the screen. So you get a lot of like random new things. Like the landscape has definitely evolved from when Jessie and I were interviewing for jobs, like, you know, years ago. There's a lot more creativity that goes in. Another thing that's really popular these days is values interviews. Like especially at startups, you know, they'll say, hey, these are our company's core values, and like we just want to know that like you embody them. But it's basically a behavioral interview. So any behavioral interview stuff is going to be great for that. And you just frame it around the company's values. Like you basically say that you embody like moving fast without like necessarily saying those words. But yeah.
Are there common differences that you notice in how boot camp grads will approach these challenges versus classic computer science grads?
I haven't noticed anything.
Yeah, I haven't either. I also a lot of times don't even look at somebody's resume before the interview, because I'm just like too busy. So I usually don't even know, which I think is good, because then they're not really biased either way.
I agree with that. I'm like, I'll look at it after. I'm going to ask the same question.
Yeah.
Very, very true. If you get asked a question where you're not entirely confident in the right answer, is it better to feign confidence or to admit that you're not entirely sure, but this is your understanding?
I have read interview feedback that's like, this candidate admitted when they didn't know stuff. I loved that. I've read that kind of feedback a lot. And I think that that's a pretty common thing. Remember, these are going to be people that you're going to be working with. Don't feign confidence. I don't think it'll work well.
Nice. And I think this question goes in the same vein. What if you literally can't get to the solution even with brute force?
If the interviewer is doing their job correctly, they should be giving you hints. Like you're kind of trained to recognize when the candidate is struggling and to give them appropriately sized hints. If they're not doing that, you might have to explicitly ask for something and say like, hey, can you give me a pointer, or like, can you point me in the right direction? Like, I'm just not getting it. And like, even if you end up in that situation, that doesn't necessarily mean, again, that you're going to fail the interview. It could be anything. Like I've also been in interview debriefs where somebody will say, you know, the candidate like missed this really big thing, but it was the end of the day, and I think they were really tired. So it kind of makes sense. Like everyone, they have empathy, you know? So don't be worried about that situation.
I'd also say if the hints you're getting are not relevant to where you're stuck, it usually means that you have not explained your thought process well enough. So you really want to walk through like what you have tried and why you have rejected it, so that the interviewer can give you hints that are going to help you.
This question, I think most people can relate to. How much time is too much time to be quiet while thinking? Sometimes I like to take some time to think, but then I'm nervous that I'm taking too much time, and then that affects my ability to think clearly.
I prefer people to think out loud, which is the kind of skill you have to practice. Like no one can just do that. If you really, really cannot get thinking out loud working, what I would recommend is saying, give me a second to think about this. And then once you finish thinking about it, however long that takes, tell me what you thought. Tell me like, what are all the things you walked through? Why did you pick this? What did you discard? So that you're still giving me a chance to like understand what you spent that time doing. If you do that, I guess I don't like when people go, if you want like a specific number, I think 30 seconds is when I get about to like trying to prompt them with maybe a hint or something.
I would also say that like I know some candidates like really just can't do this, or like the idea of multitasking and like talking while you're writing code is just like ugh. And I've seen people, what they'll do is they'll like explain what they're gonna do and then type it out, or like type it out and then explain what they just wrote. Or even like sometimes, people be worried about their like English skills, and they'll, instead of speaking it, they'll just like type out a comment above each line or something. Like I think those are all workable solutions. You can find something that works for you. You don't necessarily have to talk out loud. It just makes it a lot easier on your interviewer.
Absolutely. So we're almost to time, but I think we take just this last one. So if you get asked a question in an interview that you've already done and solved as practice, should you tell the interviewer?
Yes, every
I
time.
I would like you to, for
But
two
I will
reasons.
also say
Oh,
that even when I get that response, I still make them do it, because I still like 90% of the time they're still not like spot on about it. So if you're gonna admit it, you might want to admit it like in a not super confident way. Like I wouldn't say I've seen this problem and I've crushed it, because like you may not have, and you probably didn't crush it according to like the interviewer's standards. So I would say like, hey, I think I've seen this problem before, or like, I mean, it definitely, if like another interviewer on the loop already gave you the same question, like just make sure you're honest, because they're gonna talk later. But I can tell 99% of the time when somebody's seen it and they don't say it, because the way that they go through the problem is so obvious, like so obvious, and that just comes off looking like disingenuous.
yeah, I was gonna say that, like, usually we can tell if you've seen it before because you're not stumbling at the same places everyone else stumbles at. Like it's kind of weird to watch when you've given the same interview 30 times. And on top of that, like you're gonna look really genuine, if you're like, oh, I've actually seen this. I just want to make sure you knew. Like, I'm gonna be like, oh my God, what an honest candidate. So
Awesome. That's a great note to end on. Honesty is the best policy. Thank you so much, Jessie and Naomi. Danielle, do you have any last words before we close out?
Nope. Thank you to both of our speakers. This was great. Thank you to all the attendees. That's it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but great to see such great participation, and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Good luck, everyone.